we were talking the last couple of days about this mitzvah of Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, of telling over the story. And yesterday, Lois made the point, emphasized the point. Hey, Estelle, that the mitzvah is to tell it over, and it's especially the way the Rambam goes on, so does the Haggadah, to say that this mitzvah applies even to people that are chachamim and navonim, people with chachma and bina, which, depending on context, might mean, in this context, it might mean chachma might mean that you have lots of data, you have lots of information, and bina would be that you have looked deeply into those ideas, and you not only have the data, but you understand the depth of meaning of it. There's all sorts of different ways to approach those words, chachma and bina. But anyways, there is a benefit still to tell about it. So it's not, although in form, the idea is one generation passes on the story to the next generation. It's really about telling the story. And I was thinking about this because up until this point, up until we were talking about it, and I even told you over the story about how I thought that the Seder turned into something it wasn't originally designed for, because you have all these kids in school preparing for like a month with all this Torah for them to tell at the Seder, as opposed to having an opportunity to ask their own questions and to really hear something new. So that might be true from the perspective of the form of it, which is the idea that one generation's passing on information to the next generation. And that's certainly on one level what's supposed to be happening. But I was not valuing their benefit from telling the story. In other words, when they come, they're prepared to tell the story, not to hear the story. And so I thought that's a flaw, but not necessarily, especially after that that emphasis that Lois was suggesting, which is the benefit to the teller. And especially when you see Hallel at the end, and that we're looking to feel grateful, and so that we can praise Hashem from our place of gratitude for taking us out of Egypt. That comes from telling the story, not just from hearing the story. So I'm rethinking my original concern about the kids coming to talk and not necessarily to listen. And maybe both are true. Maybe there needs to be a little bit of both, but it's not necessarily a flaw that they're coming to learn how to tell the story as well. Okay, so now let's see here. Okay, all right. So now we are on Mitzvah 158, and Mitzvah 158 is that he commanded us to eat matzah on the night of the 15th of Nisan, where there is a Pesach lamb, or whether there's a Pesach lamb or not. And that is his, maybe said, a blessed saying, at evening you shall eat matzos. And the regulations of this commandment have already been explained in Tractate Psachim, which is all about Pesach, and also Parshas Bo, Mishnah Torah 11, and unleavened bread. Yesterday, and maybe the day before, I was just observing, or maybe commenting on the fact that what we observe, the Pesach we observe, is a kind of hybrid of themes that at the very beginning, it's very much focused on Pesach, and the symbol of the beginning of the holiday is related to the lamb or goat that is offered. But then there's this other theme of matzah. So we have two names for the holiday. One name is Pesach, which the korban is named after, and the other one is that the offering is named after. But the other one is Chag Hamatzos, the holiday of matzah. So here the Rambam is emphasizing that it is a standalone mitzvah to eat matzah that night. That matzah is not part of the context of Pesach, not simply part of the context of Pesach. Certainly, you're supposed to have matzah with the Pesach, and part of the context, even for the Pesach theme, the lamb-related theme, is matzah and maror. But even without the korban Pesach, you're supposed to still have matzah. Now, we think of this as something really only applicable after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. That before the Beis Hamikdash is destroyed, that everyone at their Seder would have korban Pesach and matzah and maror, all as described in the Torah. The truth is, there were always Jews that did not have a korban Pesach at their meal, and this would be Jews who lived too far away to make the pilgrimage. Not everybody made the pilgrimage. I don't know if there. In that the first year, everybody would have had the korban Pesach when there's that last night that they're in Egypt. And the next year, all those who were pure would have had the korban Pesach, and then hopefully all the rest of them would have had korban Pesach the next month. So all of them would have tasted the korban Pesach. Then it doesn't seem like they had Pesach it's unclear, but from the beginning of the book of Yoshua, it seems like they didn't have Pesach the next years, that during those 38 extra years that they were in the desert because of the spies, it doesn't seem like they had Pesach during that time. You could argue both ways, but it sounds like that from the book of Yoshua that they may not have. So then you have the first Pesach that they are all together in Israel. And during that time, again, you'd assume that everybody who's pure would have had korban Pesach, and then everybody else hopefully would have had it. The ones who didn't have it would have made up for it the next month and had the korban Pesach again. Not clear what happened during the rest of the time during the wars. But then afterwards, when they divide up Israel, there are people that live quite a distance from the Beis Hamikdash. It's not clear. It doesn't seem like everybody made it. Certainly not everybody had to go. You only had to make the pilgrimage if it was reasonable to do it, and there was like a certain distance. If you were farther than that distance, you didn't actually have an obligation to come to the Beis Hamikdash with your korban. So it's very likely, and certainly when the settlements start to scatter, and certainly during the second Beis Hamikdash, when people are living in, many people are still living in Bavel, and in some other places like Alexandria and some other places, it's very unlikely that all these people went to the Beis Hamikdash for the pilgrimage. So these people wouldn't have korban Pesach. So not having korban Pesach at your meal was not just something that was a result of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Not having a korban Pesach at your meal just might be a result of not living close to where the Beit HaMikdash is and not coming on the pilgrimage. So therefore, there might have been lots of people that didn't have korban Pesach even while the Beit HaMikdash was around. So what do they do at their Seder? Their Seder would look like our Seder without the Korban Pesach. We look forward to the Korban Pesach being brought, in our time again. But until that time, we at our Seder we have objects that remind us of the Korban Pesach. We have a shank bone or something on the Seder plate that's supposed to remind us of it. And then we have the afikomen. We eat the afikomen in place of the Korban Pesach that they would have eaten at the Seder. But it's something that would have even happened even during times of a kind of robust Jewish commonwealth. There still might have been people that didn't have a Korban Pesach at their Seder. The word, when we talk about the symbolism of the Korban Pesach, of the lamb or the goat, so there's lots of themes that are associated with it. There's like a wealth of discussion about the fact that Egypt somehow saw the lamb as a kind of divine symbol, and that it was a representative of the kind of a pagan Egyptian culture at the time. Even though when people study Egyptian culture, they highlight the Egyptians as a place that was less pagan than a lot of other places around, and that they were sort of close to a monotheistic idea. I'm not really a scholar of it, but I've seen many who talk about it. Also, if you look to try to find the lamb or goat as a symbol or an important pagan deity of the Egyptians, you can't find it as far as I know. But we have this kind of very established tradition that it was a deity in Egypt, that they found it repulsive that people shepherded sheep or ate sheep. It was one of the reasons, one of the ways Yosef got a separate place for his family in Goshen, because he told Paro, that his family are raised sheep, or his family told Paro they raise sheep, and they, so that's probably not a good idea for them to be doing it right in the heart of the Egyptians. Also, Egyptians didn't eat with Jews. That also seems to be an issue when the brothers come down, that Egyptians don't eat with Jews. And so you'll see in the commentaries, because Jews ate lamb, and they considered it to be problematic. So the Rambam has this kind of well-developed notion that there are a lot of mitzvahs that we observe that whose goal is to distance us from the ways of idolatry. And especially when we sacrifice different animals, part of what we're doing is nullifying the culture of the people that we're surrounded with. And so for Korban Pesach, since it was such a important symbol to the Egyptians of their culture, by shechting it, we are nullifying Egyptian culture. We're nullifying the kind of foreign, the connection that we have to this foreign way of seeing the world, because we're going to emerge as a people who represent a different way in the world. Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardoza, who I first met as he was a teacher at Or Sameach when I was teaching at Or Sameach. So in some sense, he was a colleague, but he was way more a mentor than a colleague to me. So he somehow I was getting to Rabbi Cardoza. So he when he tells over his path to becoming a teacher of Torah and Jewish ideas. So he tells how he began to study philosophy in college. He was in Amsterdam. He wasn't a religious Jew initially. And he was in Amsterdam, and he was studying philosophy at college. And he was just completely enamored with it. He loved it. And he was having a conversation with one of his favorite professors. And he told the professor that he loves the questions, but when they finally get to the answers to some of these questions, he finds them unsatisfying. They're just not satisfying. The questions, he's just aflame with the questions, but then no matter who it is, when amongst the philosophers that he's studying, he just never finds their answers measure up to the beauty of the questions. So his professor said to him, "You're Jewish, aren't you?" And he said, "Yes." He says, "Well, my understanding is that the Jewish thinkers were asking a lot of these same questions, and they had a different path. Maybe you'll be interested in studying the questions and then the answers as they are given in Jewish text." And this became his adventure that led him to eventually become one of the really effective teachers of Torah later on. But so this notion that Judaism is going to represent a different way of thinking, in order to get to that different way of thinking, you have to let go of the way you've been thinking until now. This was a theme I was talking about last night in my Tuesday night class, which is that letting, when Avram is told, you have to leave your land, the place where you were born, your father's house, and go to this other place, that on one level he's being asked to let go of this vision or vantage point, this context from which he saw the world. In order to be able to see from a different place, you have to sometimes let go of the way you saw it before. So according to the Rambam, this korbanos, there are elements of korbanos of every sacrifice that involve this, that you're amongst the other things that are going on in a sacrifice. Part of it is like releasing yourself from the context or the worldview of the cultures that are around you. So especially that first Pesach that they're observing in Egypt, they're in the midst of doing that. Before they can leave Egypt physically, they have to leave Egypt emotionally and viscerally on these different levels of perception. And that would be also symbolized when they put the blood of the Pesach offering on the doorposts. When you actually walk out through the door, it's like you're leaving Egypt behind. So this is part of what we mean by celebrating Pesach. And it could be even part of the process when we're telling over the story of denigrating Egypt, of denigrating, of talking about the lowness of the experience of Egypt, that in some way we're trying to do that. We're trying to nullify the Egypt that's within us so that we can move to this new way of seeing the world and seeing God as we move on. There's another aspect of the Pesach offering, the name itself, Pesach. It's often translated as Passover. In fact, it's almost always universally translated as Passover. That God passed over the Jewish firstborn when he was killing the Egyptian firstborn, he passed over the Jewish houses, he passed over the Jewish firstborn, and did not kill them. That's how it's typically translated. But Rabbi David Foreman makes a compelling argument that this is not a useful translation, and that there are other places where this word comes up, Pei Samaches, this word comes up, and it doesn't mean pass over. It means to go back, over and back, like this, over and back. And that, like, for instance, when Eliyahu is on Mount Carmel, he asks the people over there, how long are you going to be jumping from the fences? It sounds like his criticism is that sometimes you're living one way and then sometimes you're living another one, and you're going back and forth between God and Baal, and God and idolatry. Like, there's sometimes when you're completely in with God and you're living that kind of life, and then you find yourself going back to this other fence, which is the fence of Baal, and then you're living like Baal and going there. It struck me that this could be, if you look at how some people explain the word Benoni, like a person who's like in an intermediate place. So you have the tzaddik on the one hand. This is a person who is consistently acting correctly. And then you have the Rasha on the other side of the spectrum. This is a person who's reliably acting incorrectly. I think it's George Carlin who made the observation that if you have an aunt with bad taste in clothing, like she always sends you something and it's always wrong, it's the wrong clothing, he said, it's always wrong. It's not usually wrong. It's always wrong. There's certain people that, and I've heard that there are people like this when it comes to investment advice. Like, there are certain people that it's not like sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. There are certain people, it's always wrong. I even asked some friends of mine that manage people investments, if they have certain people like that, do they monitor these people who they believe always get it wrong, just to see what they're saying so they know for sure what not to do. Whatever they say is 100% not good. Put all your money in Bitcoin or something like that. It's always going to be wrong, whatever they say to do. Are there people like that? And they laughed, because they do sort of have that, certain people that they just find are always getting it wrong. And they do sometimes pay attention. They were laughing about that. So the Rasha would be like that. The Rasha is like just reliably wrong. He's reliably acting wrong. So on the one hand, you have the tzaddik. He's reliably acting correctly. And then the Rasha is reliably acting incorrectly. And then you have the Benoni. So the Benoni, from this understanding, I'm not saying what the Tanya, in the Tanya, they have a discussion of the Benoni that's different than this. There's obviously different levels of understanding the Benoni, but this would be one of them, that the Benoni is, because we're told most of us are a Benoni, and so just reflecting on my own self, I find there's times when I'm all in and very committed to acting correctly and sort of reliably acting correctly, and then there's times when I'm back on the fence and sort of reliably acting correctly, and I'm going back and forth between the two. So there's a meaning of Pei Samaches where you're going back and forth on these two. So there's a model. I forget where he cited it from. I could find it, but it would take a little bit. It's from one of the Nevi'im. It might be from Yeshayahu, and he's characterizing, I'm pretty sure it's Yeshayahu. He's characterizing, and if it was Yeshayahu, I think it's within the first, like 20 chapters of Yeshayahu or somewhere around there. So he's talking about how the eagle it goes back and forth, flies over back and forth to protect its young, that it goes back and forth like that to protect its young. So that going back and forth of the mother, of the eagle mother, going back and forth, that is characterized as Pei Samaches, that this root. So he was suggesting the more likely translation for the name Pesach is not that Hashem passed us over, but that Hashem was protecting us like a mother bird. He's like going back and forth, hovering over us, going back and forth like that, protecting us from the harm that's happening to the Egyptian firstborns, which is being carried out by this thing called the destroyer. So he's like going back and forth like that. So this notion is also one of the themes of Pesach. Certainly it was given that name, Korban Pesach. So you have this theme of nullification of Egyptian culture. You also have this kind of relationship with God as a mother protecting us, which is happening earlier on, and perhaps is part of the theme of the clouds of glory. These clouds of glory were said not to just hover above the Mishkan or be a pillar in front of us, but they surrounded us and protected us. And it's often identified with the Shekhinah, which is the God's divine presence, in a kind of protective motherly embrace, as it were. So this would be calling attention to this first experience we have of God as a kind of protective mother, hovering over us back and forth, protecting us from it. So that would be part of the theme of Pesach. And there are, when you start to get into the details, there are layers upon layers of meaning available there. So that would be Pesach, which again is the theme of the beginning of the holiday. And then there's matzah. Now, matzah also has layers and layers of meaning. Our attention is called to two things in the Haggadah. Like when the Haggadah talks about it, it calls it a bread of affliction, and it reminds us that we were slaves, and it was considered to be the bread of slaves in Egypt. In much of the world, it was everybody's bread. In much of the world, that's the kind of bread people ate. One time when I was, I don't remember where we were. We might have been at this place, Eretz Bereshit. It was a place like that, where they're trying to call us back to the time of Avraham. And they made bread on a tabun. Tabun is not only a restaurant in Skokie, but it's a way of baking bread. It looks like an upside down bowl, like a metal bowl, like a large metal bowl, like a mixing bowl, but a large one that's turned over, and the hot coals are underneath it. So the bowl becomes very hot, and then you prepare the dough, and then you rub it, you roll it out so that it's flat, and then you put the flat dough over the tabun, and it bakes very quickly, like in a minute. In a minute, it's baked. And that's lafa, what we call lafa nowadays. And that is how people ate bread in most of the world for much of history. But again, we talked about this a couple of days ago. In Egypt, they were now their culture was sort of embraced risen dough or sourdough. So there would have been people with more time, perhaps, and a safe place to keep the dough so it could rise. There were a lot of people that had risen dough. So risen dough became, it seems like from the Haggadah, risen dough was the food of the free person, but the flat, more like lafa, was the bread that was symbolically sort of the bread of slaves. Um, so it reminds us of our slavery and the affliction of slavery, the affliction of our slavery. But it's also, and as matzah continues in our culture, and even in the early parts of our sacrificial lives, after we leave Egypt, matzah becomes the characteristic bread of sacrifice. There's bread associated with a lot of the sacrifices, and that bread, or the service in the Beit HaMikdash, but that bread is supposed to be matzah. It's not supposed to be risen dough. It's not getting a chance to rise. It's not necessarily, again, not wafer crackers necessarily, but some of it might have been. But most of it was probably not. Certainly the showbreads weren't, but they weren't given a chance to rise, so they still are classified as matzah. Matzah, it becomes the bread of the Beit HaMikdash. There are exceptions. There is one offering, the Torah offering, that has a lot of different kinds of bread, and a part of it was risen. And also there are 2 loaves that are brought on Shavuos that are risen dough. But other than that, everything is supposed to be matzah. You're not supposed to have chametz. There, the theme seems to be that chametz itself is the problem. Chametz is what you're trying to get away from. That chametz represents perhaps ego, the idea of rising, like ego symbolically leads to arrogance, which is like a rising within the person. It comes to symbolize sin, which sort of rises within a person. And so if you look at some of the verses, especially destroy the seor in your house, there it sounds like the problem is the rising agent. And so when you look in the commentaries, it's more about sinfulness and arrogance, which we're meant to stay away from. So that's another theme of matzah, that it doesn't have that it's bread, but without the side effects that could come from a luxurious lifestyle, which would lead to ego, materialism, and sinfulness. So these are a couple of the themes that are related to matzah, and that's where you see a lot of the attention drawn to. When you think about Pesach, it's sort of like Sukkot. They both have mitzvahs that require a good amount of preparation before you get to the holiday. Not for us, because we can buy our matzah, many of us do, but in a time when you were making your own matzah, there's a lot to think about in order to make matzah that doesn't have chametz in. It takes some thought and preparation, and then actually baking the matzahs. It could be a good amount of work before you ever get there. But the real big work is cleaning up to make sure that there is no chametz. Again, you could decide you're staying at a Pesach program and you don't have to worry about that. But for most of the Jewish population who are not staying at a Pesach program, so cleaning the house for Pesach is the real great work, and it takes a while. It could take. Rav Scheinberg famously he used to give this class every year for years. He used to give a class to women to explain to them how they could clean for Pesach in just a couple hours, that they don't need to do spring cleaning at the same time that they're cleaning for Pesach. Because for many women, the burden of cleaning for Pesach was on their shoulders, on top of everything else, the food and taking care of the kids and everything else. And it's almost brings many women to a breaking point. And he was trying, as an act of loving kindness, he was trying to help them, sort of mentor them on how they could clean for Pesach. And he claimed, most religious Jews in Israel live in apartments, he claimed that you could get entire Pesach cleaning done in 3 hours. My wife was famously at one of those classes, and Rav Scheinberg was, telling over, how to do it. And then when he finished, his wife just sort of said aloud, "I just wait till he leaves, and then I clean all day." Even his own wife wouldn't listen to him. He would say, "You don't need to do this. You don't have to clean you could just wipe things down with with a cleaning agent, and don't worry about all that." And so at the end of the whole thing, she just goes, "I just wait till he leaves the house, and then I spend my time cleaning." So, but certainly, mystics, when they talk about cleaning for Pesach, this is a huge service. It's actually not the mitzvah. It's that there is a mitzvah of destroying the chametz, and cleaning for Pesach is for chametz. It's an extension of that mitzvah. But it's, again, there are people that could have Pesach without spending any time by going somewhere else for Pesach. So it's not an essential part of the mitzvah, but it is de facto a big part of it. And the mystics, when you read Hasidic Sfarim that are drawing on this mysticism, and other books that are drawing on the mysticism, they make a great deal about that process, because this is you're acting out the process of ridding yourself of arrogance and ridding yourself of haughtiness and sinfulness. So this is a huge part of the preparation for what is going to be the liberation. These are both liberation. You're by focusing on the suffering in Egypt, and then that God took us out. That's one way of focusing on liberation. And another way of focusing on liberation is the liberation from the worldview, that the lens of the world that you're seeing through haughtiness and sinfulness. You're liberating yourself from that too, so that you can rise to a higher place. So both of these, the Pesach offering and matzah, are very important themes, especially at the beginning of Pesach and on the Seder night. Eventually, most of the focus becomes the matzah for the rest of it. And so when he's saying right away, he's saying it's a mitzvah to eat matzah, and it's a mitzvah to eat matzah even if there's no Korban Pesach. It's because of this hybrid nature of Pesach, and it's an absolutely essential feature of what is supposed to be the focus of Pesach. Okie dokie. I am very grateful to have this opportunity to learn with you guys today, and I look forward to doing it again very soon. I say Monday. Be well. Be well.
Love you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. And our learning, wait, before you go, our learning was in the merit of a refuah shlema for David Nemat ben Motaram, and for the healing of all those who have been injured, for the return of the hostages speedily and in good health, for the healing for the protection of our soldiers, for the protection of everybody in Israel, and protection for all of us. Be well. Be well.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Amen.
At
Bye-bye.
least one bracha.
Yes.